Hi, I'm Margarita R. Sonko, formerly Deputy Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority. For today, we're going to discuss Session 9 of Module 2, and this refers to the formulation of the Post-Disaster Rehabilitation and Recovery Program. So what do we expect at the end of this session? We expect you to be able to develop the Post-Disaster Rehabilitation and Recovery Program, and second, to improve the pre-disaster rehabilitation and recovery program. Okay, so today we're going to discuss Session 9 of Module 2, and this pertains to the formulation of post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery program. Just to recall, there are 5 steps in the rehabilitation and recovery process, and program formulation is the third in the process. So what are the different components of the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery program? There are 13 components. The first refers to the background and description of affected areas. The second, description of a hazard event. The third, assessment of the effects of the disaster. The fourth is the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework that was discussed in a previous session. The fifth refers to the objectives of the program. The sixth refers to the rehabilitation and recovery strategies. The seventh refers to targets. The eighth, and I think you're more familiar with this, it is the proposed land use framework. The ninth is the phasing of programs, projects, and activities, and implementation arrangements. The 10th, financing and investment requirements. The 11th refers to the sector programs, projects, and activities. The 12th refers to the mechanism for monitoring and evaluation. And lastly, the communications strategy. We will go over this one by one very briefly. So the first step involves the background and description of the affected areas. What does this cover? This covers the location, topography and climate, natural resource, economic activities prior to the disaster. We're referring to pre-disaster situations or conditions of the communities, and social and demographic data. These refer to the characteristics of the population. For the pandemic, for example, you're doing a program relating to COVID-19, you may include among the information the LGU's health workforce as well as the health system capacity of the community. The information may come from existing plans of the LGUs. So nandyan na yan sa inyo, you don't have to go far, nandyan na sa mga plano ninyo or some of your data requirements or availability in the other plans that you have been doing. And these are available, for example, the Pag-asa, PhilVolks, DNR, Mines and Geosciences Bureau, and NAMRIA. The second component refers to the description of a hazard event. So this also includes its immediate effects. Where do you get all this information? You will get this from the situational reports from the Office of Civil Defense, or OCD, and other relevant government agencies, as we mentioned earlier, PhilVolks, Pag-asa, MGB, and NAMRIA. The next component is an assessment of the effects of the disaster. This involves both the physical assessment and the socio-economic assessments. So for the physical assessment, this will include description of the damaged physical infrastructures, anong bridges, roads, buildings na nasira because of the disaster, or alterations in the topography and environment, highlighting key landmarks that were affected. In the case of the socio-economic assessments, you will include the summary of damage and losses in key sectors. Madalas na sinasabi natin, this involves infrastructure, social, livelihood, mga livelihood, housing, and the macroeconomic impact of the disaster, and the statistics on the number of internally displaced casualties, missing and injured persons. Assessment of vulnerable sectors, which includes the children, women, and the poor. Again, the information will come from the PDNA that was prepared before. However, we should highlight the human recovery needs, which is also available from the PDNA. So moving on, we are now on the fourth content of the Rehabilitation and Recovery Program. And you should be familiar with this because this was discussed in an earlier session, and this refers to the Rehabilitation and Recovery Framework. Just to refresh your memory, while we have the general framework for post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework, it should be tailored fit to the areas and sectors affected as well as the disaster context. And secondly, the overall outcomes, sector outcomes, cross-cutting concerns, they will vary for each rehabilitation and recovery program. You have to take note of those differences when it comes to each particular disaster whenever it happens. The next slide will show you that the program should also have its objectives, no? But what should characterize the different objectives for the program? It will be very easy to understand. We can put them all together in a short, like SMART. So the objective should be SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. The objective should also consider the expected outcomes from interventions for sectors to be covered. What are some examples of objectives? 1, to restore, rehabilitate, or reconstruct damaged infrastructure necessary to sustain economic and social activities in the affected areas. So, syempre, gusto nyo makita na yung mga roads, bridges, buildings, they will be restored to the pre-disaster conditions. And not only restored, but improved. You have the revised, for example, the revised building code. So, mas malakas na sila. They're even able to withstand greater or more destructive disasters. Another objective will be to restore houses, and this is closer to the different communities, or rebuild settlements and basic community facilities and services. This will involve schools, health centers, etc. And they should be more resilient to the hazard events in the future in the case that similar disasters will impact on the different communities. Another objective will be to restore, strengthen, and expand economic activities of the affected communities. Siyempre, gusto niyo makita na yung livelihood ng mga tao, ma-restore siya, or even improved with increased production. And another example will be to increase resilience and capacities of communities in coping with future hazard events. But these objectives could be made more specific, such as by citing which particular infrastructure facilities need to be reconstructed or rehabilitated, expected time to complete these activities, or what kind of economic activities need to be supported and promoted, what standards should be enforced, or what are the capacity or capability build up are needed by the stakeholders in the community. Moving on, you have the rehabilitation and recovery strategies. Anong ibig sabihin nito? Strategies are the pamamaraan, and this will aid in the achievement of a desired outcome and goal specified in the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework. So, for example, this will involve sustainable income sources for households and stability of businesses restored, economic and social conditions in disaster-affected areas restored with higher level of resiliency. The next characteristic of strategies are they should be consistent with the guiding principles for the rehabilitation efforts. What are some of these principles in the rehabilitation effort? One, they should be consistent with the development goals and objectives of the locality, city, or municipality. So they should not differ from the different objectives of the concerned communities. Second, they should be broad enough to cover all affected sectors and fully integrated for ease of coordination. Third, another principle is they should be evidence-based. You use available data to be able to come up with your strategies. Another principle will be forward-looking. While based on statistical trends and informed predictions, it should consider the likely impact on future and emerging disasters. So hindi lang yung kasalukuyan ang titignan ninyo, but you have to look forward and see how this will impact on prospective disasters that are likely to happen in your community. Another principle, that they should be outward-looking. It takes into account the situations or developments not only in your respective communities, but also what is happening in your neighboring communities or cities or municipalities. So marami kayong consider when it comes to coming up your different strategies. Also, they should be sector-specific, and subsector strategies will also help to achieve the program objectives for the short and medium term. The next slide will show you again specific strategies, pero this time this will be by sector. As we discussed before, sectoral kuminsan ang approach natin when it comes to the framework or the programs. So again, for this, we will give you example by sector. One, you have livelihood and business development. A strategy could be to develop sustainable disaster and climate change resilient employment and livelihood activities, promote resilient and competitive industries, and establish a strong market presence for products and services delivered by the affected areas, and improve access to financial services and microinsurance for micro, small, and medium enterprises and households. For agriculture and fisheries, what are the strategies that we can adopt? Develop and implement interventions for agriculture and fisheries that will provide immediate and sustainable sources of food and income. Another strategy will be to improve access to credit and microinsurance for farmers and fisher folks. Bakit nauulit yung financial services? Di ba usually after disaster, the people in the affected communities, they don't have the financial resources to be able to continue with their lives or with their livelihood activities. So they need assistance from the government, particularly when it comes to financing. Kaya mahalaga yung financial services, lalo na for the small, the micro, and medium enterprises. Moving on, another sector strategy will involve housing and settlement. So what are the strategies that we can adopt? Identify and acquire safe and suitable land for housing development. Diba, pag may disaster, usually those in the coastal areas are affected, or those who, because of landslides, they have to move to safer areas. So you need to acquire safe and suitable land where they can be resettled for housing development. Second will be to adopt a comprehensive housing program covering emergency shelter assistance to permanent housing. When it comes to a disaster or after a disaster, hindi naman ibig sabihin you relocate the people affected kaagad sa permanent areas where they can be resettled. Usually, emergency housing, very temporary yan because sometimes it takes time and effort to identify suitable locations where they can be relocated. Aside from the suitable areas, you have to provide livelihood opportunities as well as utilities, power, as well as water. And for social services, what strategies can be adopted? This will include continue the provision of social service programs focusing on severely affected areas and highly vulnerable population. Provide adequate health and mental support to aid individuals. So, importante yan, health ng mga tao. Diba, usually those who were relocated, either dinala yan sa mga gyms or sa mga eskwelahan, their health should also be looked after. And what is emerging at this point because of the recent disasters is also address the mental conditions of those who have been affected by the different disasters. And then you have to adopt social protection mechanisms that increase employment and improve livelihood. So still on strategies, we move on to examples for physical infrastructure. A strategy that would be useful is to strengthen enforcement of structural laws that set standards for resilient infrastructure. Another one is to establish effective and efficient processes to facilitate the completion of infrastructure projects within the agreed time frame and with the highest quality results. Ayaw naman natin na ang mga reconstruction will take forever and ever until the next typhoon comes in. No? So there should be a time within which we have to accomplish or complete some of these reconstruction activities. Another example is to harness partnership with the private sector and development partners to augment resources and technical assistance. Usually, the resources of the local communities, local government units are not enough to be able to support or fund the reconstruction or recovery efforts. So this is where the assistance of the private sector, whether corporations or individuals, can come in, as well as assistance from other governments or development partners. Hindi lang financial resources, they can also help you in coming up with technical assistance to the implementation of your respective projects. Okay, so tapos na tayo sa strategy. We move on to another important component of the formulation of a post-disaster recovery program. So the targets, they should be specific for each program and project. Hindi pwedeng masyadong broad. Otherwise, we will not be able to monitor if we're veering away from our targets or we are not able to accomplish what we have set for ourselves. And they should also be disaggregated annually and by location or area. These requirements will make it easier for us to be able to monitor to see if we are on track in the implementation of the recovery program. So another component will be, which is closer to your heart at the local government level or the communities, will be the proposed land use framework. I'm sure many of you have already your own land use framework. This will guide in the identification of locations for infrastructures to be constructed, settlement sites to be built, and economic activities post-disaster. So, kailangan yan para hindi bara-bara yung kung saan i-resettle na lang yung mga tao or where industries will be located. At least naman, you have something to guide you or in your planning where settlement areas and activities will be undertaken. Second, the land use framework should be guided by the updated development and land use plan of the area and existing local shelter plans and risk assessment. Siyempre, titignan mo rin, ano ba yung mga risk kung dito natin lalagay yung mga industries natin or the infrastructure, masisira ba din sila when another disaster comes in? So we have to think of all these considerations to be able to maximize the use of your resources. For disasters with major physical impact, a new land use framework may be needed to consider changes in the topography and the land use of the area. So pag medyo malaki yung tama ng disaster, ng hazard dun sa area, you may need to come up with a new land use framework to consider the changes post-disaster. But for disasters with no significant physical or structural impact to the affected area, the land use framework shall be used to enforce existing land use policies. So, the program, the Rehabilitation and Recovery Program, will have different programs, projects, and activities, as well as their implementation arrangements. This is what we call PPAs for short. Usually, you have the short term. These are usually implemented within 1 year. And these involve the provision of basic services, the basic needs to the affected communities to return to a state of normalcy. Parang where they were before the disaster, you'll just try to bring them back where they are. So wala pang changes because of climate change or considering more disaster risk arrangements. The second will be during the medium term, which involves 3 to 4 years after the disaster. So these usually are just a continuation of the programs, projects, and activities that were initially implemented in the short term. Now, the PPAs, or programs, projects, and activities implemented in the medium term will now give emphasis on enhancing the resiliency of the communities against disasters by integrating concepts and principles on disaster prevention and mitigation, as well as disaster preparedness. So you're not, for the medium term, you're not just satisfied or contented with going back to the pre-disaster situation or conditions. You need to improve your different conditions. That is why you have to consider or put into the equation additional concepts or integrating activities that will improve the resiliency of your buildings, physical infrastructure, as well as the livelihood of the communities affected. We mentioned programs, projects, and activities. This will not be implemented if you do not have financial resources. Siyempre, you always need money to implement or carry out these different projects. Saan ka kukuha ng resources to be able to support the implementation of these activities? One will be the budgets, the regular budgets of the national government agencies. Now, when it comes to government corporations, they would have their corporate operating budgets. And in the case of the government financial institutions, like for example, Development Bank of the Philippines, the Land Bank, these are possible sources of financing for your different programs and projects. Another source would be the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund, but this has to be endorsed by the NDRRM Council and approved by the Office of the President. So medyo you have to go through a certain process to be able to access funding from the NDRRM fund. A third source of funding would be the LGUs. The local government units themselves, they have disaster funds that they can use to implement their disaster-related activities. Another source would be non-government organizations, civil society organizations, the private sector, whether individual or corporations. So in the previous slide, we discussed the financing and investment requirements of the different programs, projects, and activities. To be able to see this quickly, we have come up with different templates. What you have on the slide shows the source of fund. We discussed this, NDRRM fund, regular agency budgets. The next column will show the number of projects. How many of the projects will be funded, for example, by the LGU themselves? How many will be funded by the private sector? And then for the next columns, what would be the investment requirements during the short term or the medium term? Para mas makikita, kailan mo kailangan yung pera. Ngayon na, or you can maybe delay the sourcing of these resources maybe 1 or 2 years from now. And then you have the last column, how much will be the total investment requirements of each of the different projects. The next slide will show you another configuration of a template still referring to the financing and investment requirements of your different projects. This time, the template is constructed in such a way that this will be by sector. How many programs and projects are in the infrastructure sector? How many are in social services? How many are in the settlement sector, livelihood, and agriculture? This table, while it shows certain sectors, is by no means exhaustive. Depending on your needs and requirements, you can adjust this depending on your requirements. Again, you have how many projects are infrastructure, how many are settlement-related activities, how many are in livelihood or agriculture. Again, what you had in the previous template, the investment requirement will be classified in the short term or medium term, and then you have your total investment requirements. Again, this gives you a bird's eye view of the financing requirements of different programs and projects that you have set yourselves to undertake after a disaster. So the table will also contain the annual breakdown of funding requirement. For example, a project will be implemented for a period of 3 years, so you have to disaggregate the requirements by the first year, second year, or the third year, so that you'll be able to determine how much will be required for each of the years it will be implemented. And then you have the funding source that was discussed earlier. We mentioned government-owned or controlled corporations, local government units, development partners, national government agencies, NDRRM fund, or even the private sector. A new information that will be contained in this table will be the implementing agencies. This could be by the LGUs, the national government agencies, for example, Department of Agriculture, DOLE, DTI, or DPWH. These are just examples. And the last column will cover the time frame for implementation period. As I stated earlier, a project could be implemented for a period of 3 years. So nakalagay yan, for example, 2021 up to 2023. You can include that in the last column of the table. The next slide will show you a table that has been populated, giving examples in previous disasters. What we have here as an example refers to agriculture and forestry. What activities have been undertaken under this sector? You have emergency employment, cash for work, for debris clearing, management and rehabilitation of farms. These are usually the activities being implemented after a disaster. Diba? Lilinisin mo yung mga kalat dyan. So, binabayaran yung mga tao who have been hired to do such activities. Anong area? So, doon sa example natin, Compostela Valley, total funding requirement, yung kabuuan na kailangan na to implement the project, it's 100 million. So when do you need this 100 million? You need the 100 million, 80 million during the first year, and the rest during the second year of implementation. Where will you get the funds to implement this project? It will come from a regular agency budget. Which is the implementing agency? Department of Agriculture. It could also be the DOLE, DNR, or the SWD, depending on the activity that will be implemented. And the time frame for implementation is for 2 years, so 2017 and 2018. So if you will recall, I mentioned that there are 13 components of the Rehabilitation and Recovery Program. We have discussed 11 components. Now there are 2 remaining components, and these refer to mechanism for monitoring and evaluation and the communication strategy. we will not be discussing these two components, as this will be discussed in greater detail in subsequent modules or sessions. So I hope we have been able to impart to you some information, and I hope after this session you will be able to craft your own post-rehabilitation and recovery program, or that you will be able to improve on your pre-disaster rehabilitation and recovery program. So thank you for listening, and I hope we will see your output at the end of the other sessions.